I can name more than a few inspirational women in my life. There's genuinely no shortage. My wife is probably where I'd likely begin, and I could easily then shift and talk about my mother at great lengths, my sister, aunties, and close friends. I could conclude with an array of acquaintances as well. But today, the day we look at John 4 and the woman at the well, and this Sunday as we commemorate International Women's Day, I want to tell you an additional story. Next slide. Anybody recognize this? It's about a 200-year-old lamp from a Middle Eastern country, Turkey. And this may start ringing some bells. A small lamp casts light at the long end of a hospital hallway late at night. A woman in a long dress with an apron makes her way carefully down the hall, peeking her head into rooms full of injured soldiers. She checks to make sure that each is as comfortable as possible. The hospital was filthy when she arrived. Loud, scary, unconscionable. A wartime facility built above a cesspool. It was hardly the place you'd expect the British, French, and Ottoman soldiers to recover. And they weren't recovering. The Crimean War, as it is now known in history books, was taking its toll. Over 40% of soldiers were dying in the hospital. Sadly, not from their wounds, as it would turn out, but from infectious disease, cholera and typhoid. 200 years ago, in 1820, 34 years before the war we just mentioned, the mother of modern nursing, Florence Nightingale, was born. She was a tough pioneer, and her groundbreaking work in hygiene set the standard for medical practices around the world. She's now known as the Lady with the Lamp. Florence Nightingale's story is one of birth into a wealthy family and how she fought her family's opposition and social constraints to become the world's most famous nurse. She was put on She was put onto the British military's radar after finishing her nursing degree and beginning to lead a revolution at a local British hospital. She was then asked to tend to the wounded in the Crimean War in the 1850s. When she arrived, conditions were not unlike some of the chaos we see today in the midst of the COVID-19 scare in many countries around the world. If you go to St. Thomas's Hospital, London St. Thomas Hospital, there is currently a 200-year memorial. We're at the 200-year mark of her birth. The bicentenary of Nightingale's birth. And there you can find this lamp. This is the lamp that Florence used as she went from ward to ward in those hospitals. She was summoned to go to Turkey, Constantinople, now Istanbul. And when she arrived with her team of nurses, they could see immediately that they were going to make a difference. They assessed the situation, and they realized that the soldiers were not receiving sanitized care. Instead, refuse, rats, dirty water, putrid air, and reused bandages, gauzes, and bedding were causing the proliferation of infectious disease. The patients had little soap, food, or clean bandages. And so Florence and her team of nurses went to work cleaning, organizing, and caring for the injured soldiers. Long before germ theory, long before they knew about viruses or bacteria, Florence overhauled their hand-washing protocol, the need for fresh air procedures, and the sanitizing of linens and bandages were just the beginning. Soon, after a complete overhaul of the hospital, the death rate dropped from 40% to just 2%. During her time in Turkey, then Constantinople, and the rounds that she made with a lamp, she and her reputation traveled all the way back to Britain. When she returned home to public praise and an award from Queen Victoria. Furthermore, she was given a large grant from the British government, and she used the money to start a nursing school called the Nightingale Training School for Nurses. Throughout her life, faith mattered greatly to Florence. But her faith was of an unconventional kind, much like her life's work. She remained a deeply religious person and a member of the Church of England, even though accused of unconventional beliefs. She kept many private diaries and wrote extensively to friends, and so we know a little bit of these beliefs. And she questioned many of the day's religious convictions. She had little patience for the male-dominated authority of the church, and she never tired to learn more about the world and other cultures. One such belief that Florence questioned was the concept of hell. She thought that a truly good and loving God would likely find a way to save all people. And this is where some of Florence's words transition us perfectly to today's story in John chapter 4. Florence found herself one time in a hospital comforting a dying prostitute. And with these words, Florence said, "My girl," the lady, the prostitute, thought that she would stand condemned before God. And Florence responded, "My girl, are you not now more merciful than the God you think you are going to? Yet the real God is far more merciful than any human creature ever was or can ever imagine." And so if you were following along as Sharon read the story today in John chapter 4, this story has been the source of a myriad of interpretations. And frequently, as we've moved into the modern world, these interpretations, sadly, can often be on polar opposite ends of the interpretive paradigms. And depending on how far back you go and what gender the scholar was and how far along we were as in our society, the more the distinct interpretations become. And so I want to juxtapose last week's reading. Do you remember where we were last week? With Nicodemus? Yeah. What was Nicodemus' story like? What were some of the salient features of that story? First, it was in the dark. Remember, that's sort of what our sermon took its cue from. It was a man. The person was named. We knew that the person was named Nicodemus. The person had prestige, apparent power, was a Jew and came from the right people group, and it was nighttime and there was no work being done. It was cool outside. The person came with a ringing endorsement of Jesus, sort of a tire-pumping moment. "Jesus, we recognize that you are a teacher come from God." And yet, as Jesus began to speak, there was an apparent complete lack of understanding on Nicodemus' part. And to the best of our abilities to sort of piece together Nicodemus' story throughout the remaining elements of John's Gospel, we don't actually know if Nicodemus ever really fully embraces the way of discipleship. In the very next chapter, the chapter we read this morning, we encounter the woman at the well. And notice the stark differences between the story in John chapter 3 with Nicodemus and the story in John chapter 4 with the woman at the well. The author is making very poignant moments here for us. In contrapoint to Nicodemus' story, we're now in broad daylight. In fact, how broad daylight are we? It's the noon hour. And here we don't encounter a man, we encounter a woman. Sadly, a nameless woman, unlike Nicodemus, who was named. A person of no apparent social power. Certainly not privileged from what we can deduce. And from a marginalized people group, not from the Pharisees and the Jews, a Samaritan. And here, in the midst of working, in fact, in the midst of working in the most harsh conditions, for whatever reason, unable to go to the well in the morning hours or in the evening hours when the sun is not blazing. And here, too, an encounter with Jesus. But this time, no tire pumping towards Jesus, rather a retort. She dances in conversation, even pushing back to Jesus. And here, instead of misunderstanding the metaphors with which Jesus approaches, it appears as though this woman completely understands Jesus' metaphorical talk about water and thirst, about husbands and worship. This engagement ends not with a questioning and a silent disappearance, but rather a healthy and loud embrace of Jesus' messiahship, so much so that she goes back to her town as a sort of evangelist of sorts and invites others to encounter Jesus as well. And so today, on this International Women's Day, I want to tell you only one of the major points that we could probably spend several minutes talking about all of them. And there are many moments in this story that we could point to speak to what's taking place and transpiring with women in the Gospel of John. But I want to point mostly to just one. I think the best readings of this text focus on the humanity of Jesus. They focus on the two-way street here. They focus on the transformative element in Jesus' own life. Did you notice that the author clearly articulates that Jesus is very tired? This is a very human Jesus that we encounter here in the Gospel of John. Not only is Jesus tired, but Jesus is thirsty. We see an element of mutuality, a two-way street, and a radical encounter and transformation, both of Jesus and of the woman. But notice, when Jesus approaches the well, who's not there yet? The woman's not there. Jesus doesn't engage the woman. Instead, the woman engages Jesus. We have to put this in perspective, okay? What did we just determine about this lady? Well, okay. Yeah, that's at the tail end. But first and foremost, she's a woman, okay? And you don't talk to men in broad daylight. You certainly don't approach them. Not without your husband present. You don't talk to them. You don't make yourself available in any which way. In the cultural context of the day, what this woman does is tantamount to sort of a scandalous behavior, and yet it's that makes the encounter with Jesus possible. In the Gospel of John, we find many amazing encounters with the women. Whether it's the Mary, the mother of Jesus, or Mary of Magdalene, or the woman caught in adultery, over and over again in the Gospel of John, we have these transformative encounters. In fact, many scholars, feminist and womanist scholars, say that John is doing his best, even though this is patriarchal thinking and this was written 2,000 years ago, and certainly not where we are today as society. There appears to be an apparent desire to lift women out from under the rule and oppression of men in power and the systems in place. But what we need to notice here is that the woman stepped up. She made the encounter. She made the challenge possible. And in today's society, women are lauded a lot more than they were in the past. And I believe it's because of those who are brave to step up. Jesus, to his credit, doesn't let the norms of the day get in the way of the encounter. Neither the time of the day, nor her nationality, not even the appearance of evil stopped Jesus either. There were no accusations on Jesus' part. There was no deep shame-causing, but simply a safe opening up. She encounters Jesus, and she pushes back. And Jesus enters into a dialogue with her. And this dialogue is a transformative one. There are many moments in the story worth noting, as I said already. She challenges Jesus. She points out the social norms of the day. She asks the questions. But there appears to be a liberation of sorts. And I want to leave you with one image of this brave lady approaching Jesus and beginning this transformative encounter, in the fact that Jesus himself has an element of transformation. It appears in his own experience with her. But the part that to me stood out, and I don't know if you noticed this, but she leaves behind her water jug when she races back to the sea. I don't think that this should go unnoticed. I think the author mentions it for a reason. Why does she leave the water jug there and take off back to the city? What does this note about her own liberation and her own sense of self?
She's received the living water?
She's received the living water, yeah. There is a deep transformative encounter, a mutuality and a reciprocity that's taking place between them.
She wants to share her experience.
She wants to share her experience. Do you know how heavy a weight those jugs of water are? When's the last time you went camping and had to fill up the water jug for the site? Have you been there? Those big blue containers full of water. These are not light, and those are made of plastic. The kind of container she was carrying was likely a ceramic, large pottery container that would have been heavy to carry filled with water, but they were strong. I believe, and give me a little bit of homiletical license here, that what took place in that transformative encounter with Jesus, that back and forth, that recognition that a man was willing to speak to her, that a man was willing to do those things, and that the brave nature of her willingness to approach the well, Jesus was sitting there. And she took it upon herself to approach and to make that encounter possible, wondering what was going to happen next. I believe she left the weight of the world behind. The weight of shame and guilt. The weight of accusations. The weight of history. The weight of all of those things that so easily beset us and hold us down. That water jug represents all of those things. And when she left it there, the one thing she was responsible for that seemed to give her meaning in life, I'm going to bring water back to my community, to my household, to my children, to whatever was there, she left that there and said, nah, I have something more, something better to say and to share and to speak. And, believe it or not, the city listens. The city listens. So to every woman who's ever been brave in the face of opposition, to every Florence Nightingale, to every woman at the well, to everyone who's ever stood in the face of oppression and marginalization, to everyone who's ever been shamed and guilted, I want to lift up these two women. was not easy. We sometimes look back and anachronistically we think nothing of it. Today it seems as though it's preposterous to think that a woman wouldn't be allowed into the nursing world or to contribute to that. And yet Florence was up against it and had to go and show the world that she had something to offer, and eventually recognized for it. And I thought, by the way, that was very apropos in light of COVID-19. As I was searching for examples, I ran across that and I thought, oh, this is perfect. She was the one that sort of pioneered hand washing, and we've heard so much about hand washing in the last 2 weeks. And then this woman at the well approaching Jesus. I want to thank women everywhere. I want to thank my mother. I want to thank my wife. I want to thank everybody who has ever stood up and tried to do whatever it took to change the perceptions, to end the violence, to work for equality. The world is a better place because of the bravery and courage. Those who continually move forward and encounter the world around them, and it's not an easy world. But God is at work transforming this place. We're in a better place than we've ever been before. And yet there's still so much further to go. So I invite all of us to participate in what it means to transform the world and make it a better place for all. Thank you. Let's sing.